Howdy, folks. Thanks for checking into Mr. Ulrich's Land of Biology. I am Mr. Ulrich, and this video is about biochemistry. I'm going to introduce you to the concepts of biochemistry and maybe refresh a little bit of your memories on chemistry class from last year. This is a bombardier beetle, and maybe you've heard of bombardier beetles. They are famous for defending themselves with not a spray of acid, as some people might think. It's actually a mixture of hydrogen peroxide and hydroquinones that when they break down, it's an exothermic reaction, releases a whole bunch of heat, and the spray is actually about as hot as boiling water, so pretty darn nasty. Now, when students tell me about chemistry class from last year, one of the things, of course, that comes up is explosions. And when we're talking about chemistry, biochemistry in particular, we don't really deal with explosions so much. Yeah, the bombardier beetle releases its water there, or material there with a popping sound, but we're typically more concerned with the more mundane things like the sending of the message from the brain to the abdomen so that it will open up the proper orifices and let this chemical reaction take place, or the structure of the chitin that makes up the exoskeleton and of the plant of the beetle, and why that helps it and allows it to survive its own chemical defenses, right? Mostly what we're going to be concerned with is things like being able to explain how a cell membrane maintains its fluid structure and stability, even though the individual phospholipids are not bonded to one another. So we'll get there. We're getting there. We're going to start off kind of a little bit further back in the beginning. Let's see. Really what we're talking about with chemistry, of course, is interactions between atoms. And we can get into nuclear chemistry and stuff like that and interactions within atoms, but basically this is what we're talking about, interactions on the atomic level. And here, of course, is the table of elements. Phosphorus was discovered by this guy, Hennig Brandt, who was trying to figure out the Philosopher's Stone, which would turn lead into gold. He was a 17th century alchemist. He discovered phosphorus when he was trying to make an elixir that would turn base metals like tin into silver. And so he took all this, actually he just grabbed a bucket and peed in it over and over and over again and collected a whole bunch of urine and cooked it in a furnace, and like cooked it into like a syrup. I mean, he must have really wanted to turn that tin into silver. And in the process of cooking this over hours and hours and hours and hours and hours, he got some chemical reactions to take place, and lo and behold, he ended up with this stuff that glowed and was phosphorus, and he didn't tell anybody about it. He wanted to keep it secret because he thought it would turn lead into gold and make him very rich. He got rich by marrying rich. Now, we don't have to concern ourselves so much with all of the elements of the periodic table. There's really only a few that we as biochemists are concerned with. The big ones, of course, are in green here, hydrogen and carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, and then phosphorus and sulfur as well. We get down into sodium, magnesium, calcium, and potassium are also important in lesser amounts. We don't have to bother ourselves with the chemistry of Einsteinium. Mendeleev, a fabulously bearded scientist, Russian scientist back in the 18th century, 19th century, is famous for discovering periodic law and noticing the pattern in reactivity and other characteristics of the different elements based on the number of electrons that were in the outer shell. And he was even able to predict the characteristics of a whole number, I think 8 different elements that hadn't even been discovered yet. And then when they were discovered and he was right, everybody was like, wow, that guy's onto something. All of these characteristics and interactions between the different elements brings us to this idea of reactivity. How willing, how likely is a particular atom going to engage in activity? And I'm sort of anthropomorphizing there with the words that I'm using, so be careful. They're not thinking about this. Atoms tend to want to have that follow that octet rule. They want to have a full valence shell on the outside. And they're going to do this either by filling a partially filled valence shell or emptying a partially filled valence shell in order to complete it. So when two atoms get close to one another and one of them wants to get rid of a valence electron that the other one needs to get, then they can kind of share it. And some of the time they're going to have a full outer valence shell, and that makes them happy. Again, anthropomorphizing, they're not really happy. And this allows them to form a bond, so the energy holds those two atoms together. Sharing of electrons between atoms make some of the most important types of bonds out there. These, when they're between nonmetals, like I said, which is what we're going to be dealing with in biological systems, we call these covalent bonds, just like we find in this hydrogen gas up above. They're not the only important bonds. We will also deal with hydrogen bonds, super duper important. They're kind of an electrostatic interaction, a flavor of ionic bonds, if you will. Not exactly the same, but it does deal with negative and positive dipole moments charges. These hydrogen bonds are the result of unequal sharing of electrons between the atoms within, in this case, the water molecule. So here's the oxygen and here's the hydrogen, right? And the oxygen kind of is an electron hog. It's highly electronegative, so it holds onto the electrons a little bit more, so we get a little negative side over here. And so those are hydrogen bonds. We're going to spend more time with that later on in the next video when we talk about water. But when the electrons aren't shared fairly equally, we call those polar bonds. There are also non-polar bonds when the electronegativity difference between the two atoms is negligible, and in hydrogen and carbon they are about the same, so there isn't much of an electronegativity difference. So methane molecules and hydrocarbons are stable, they're balanced, they make great building blocks. They can contain quite a bit of energy, and so they also make for good fuels. It takes energy to build them, and so when they break apart, that energy is then released in an exothermic reaction. Like this gentleman is holding on to bubbles of methane gas that burns quick enough that you don't burn yourself. It's pretty cool. Anyway, we'll stop there. If you have questions, please make sure you write them down. You can fire them to me at on email or on Google Classroom, or you can hold on to them for class tomorrow, and we can talk about them there. Other than that, you have another video to watch after this one, so I'm going to stop here, take a break, do something else, and then watch the water chemistry video. See you tomorrow.